Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I am your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is David Tomasi, who is one of the players of my D&D group on Sundays, as well as a neuroscientist, a psychologist, a professor, a polymath, and a polyglot. He's an amazing man. This is our second recorded conversation. The first one was about geopolitics from a European perspective and linguistics, and it went all over the map, and this conversation is about neuroscience and spirituality and religion and psychology. And I kind of have a little extra time in my content schedule because I'm in the middle of moving and don't have a lot of time to produce content. So I thought it would be a great time to introduce you all to David, who's not really online at all. So I'm not going to link anything in the description. Just really happy to connect him with you because he's just freaking brilliant and very enjoyable. So without further ado, here is David Tomasi. Can you angle it down just a bit?
Oh yeah, sure, of course.
Give me more of this.
Yeah, with that.
There we go. Yeah, there we go.
Is that all good?
You're a very handsome man, David.
Oh
Tomasi.
boy. Oh, thank you. Likewise, I think you.
Well, no, I set the camera up so I can get away with doing this stuff. But you look like a naturally strapping young man. Did you have a lot of attention from the ladies when you were on the market?
You should ask my wife that question, you know.
Or were you more of a nerd
Interview
kind
her,
of guy?
you know?
Oh, yeah?
You know what? This is something that I always find kind of interesting. I think both. I think I was definitely a nerd, as in I always loved study stuff. I was a bookworm, as they say.
Yeah.
But I definitely enjoy the company of friends, let me put it that way.
Okay. That's fair.
Is it diplomatic enough for an answer?
Very, very diplomatic. Maintains once your kids find this when they're older.
Right, exactly.
They'll maintain a righteous image of you in your mind. Is today Sunday? Oh, yeah, it is Sunday.
Today is Sunday, yes. Yeah,
it's been Christmas break is coming to an end, and so I kind of lost my days. I don't know.
Yes, it's a quite remarkable day, you know, Sunday and New Year's, Feast of the Virgin Mary, all of the above.
Oh, really?
Anyway. Yeah, indeed.
Is there a special? Is the Catholic calendar that's solar, right?
Yes, well, there's two. There's the old and the new one, or the Justinian one and the Gregorian one, which separates the Eastern from the Western Catholics.
Yeah.
In any case, yes, I would say that there's quite a bit of an overlap between the two. Yeah. But aside from Christmas, because the Eastern part celebrates on the 6th, December 6th, versus the Romans celebrate on the 25th.
Do you know why?
Most of them. Yeah, there's a difference between the Gregorian calendar and the other one. Okay. So that's the reason. But we do celebrate the Epiphany on the 6th. So, and by we, I mean the manifestation of the Holy Spirit. So
where anyway. Mary receives, or the Pentecost kind of thing.
That's later on. Yeah, but it's a manifestation of the Holy Spirit. So yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, so it's Sunday.
It is
Sunday after the New Year. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is there like a special feast today, the first Sunday after New Year?
Well, it's the 4th of Advent, 4th of Christmas, on top of being a Sunday, on top of being the feast of the Virgin Mary. So there's a lot of things that just happened this year. Yeah. And one pope will bury the other one, which is also something that didn't happen in thousands and thousands of years. Yeah, you know that we had two popes, one emeritus and one which is the current pontiff. So you have the American Pope, Pope Francis, hailing from Argentina, and then you have Pope Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, who passed away yesterday, I think at 9:30 Rome time. Yeah. So anyway, so
I was reading
it's a day full of significance.
Yeah, for sure. I was reading a little bit about Catholicism, well, specifically about Vatican II, and the impact that's had.
So you're a nerd.
No, I'm terribly not a nerd. I find it fascinating because Catholicism has a very long lineage. But in the 60s, they decided to update things. And there was one op-ed in the New York Times that spoke about like this encroachment of liberalism, by which I think the guy meant reformation or revolution or continual reform, infinite reform, like this kind of Western notion of constantly reforming, and how that got injected into Catholicism via Vatican II, and there's no going back from that. So there's a lot of rifts and stuff like that. There's conservatives and liberals. We need to keep changing. We need to stop changing. Do you have an opinion on that?
I partially agree on that one. I agree on the fact that there was a lot of change. That's, kind of, but I also agree that change was good. And I'm not saying this just to be nice. And by good, I mean, I think Vatican II made Catholicism closer to Protestantism. And in that sense, I think it's a good thing. But I'm not saying, so this is my claim. I'm not saying that, pick whichever you want. All religions and creeds are equally true. I'm not making the claim at all. In fact, any serious religion would agree that it is not the truth, that you cannot just pick and choose. But I do agree that, and it's not just my agreement, it's just the Catholic position on the matter too, that most religions do contain several kernels of truth. And so we should strive to do our best to find ways to focus on that and not on the differences. So in that sense, Vatican II, I think, accomplished that. And there's a lot of hard work to bridge the gaps, I would say. Now, this doesn't mean, however, and this is the part that I disagree with, that you could put, let's say, Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestantism in the same basket. I would say that Orthodoxy is the closest, together with Islam probably, to Catholicism. And so liberalism for liberalism's sake, that's part that I disagree with.
Huh.
And that's what I would say. I mean, so the issue is that which direction would you pick in terms of purity of tradition, right? The idea is, well, if you want to claim to follow a certain, I don't know how to phrase it, a certain belief, make sure that your belief is the closest to the truth you can find, so that you don't find a lot of changes, not because the changes are intrinsically wrong, because you might not be able to understand, for instance, a text the way it was. So for instance, if you download a file, make sure the file is not corrupt so that you have the original one, and then you can use it, to your liking. If there's something missing, then you might have a problem. So in that sense, if it were true that before Vatican II, then you had perfect tradition, and after that you had completely made up tradition, then of course anything after Vatican II should be rejected by that. But the truth is that, I want to give you an example of that. So one of the biggest changes for us was a change of the language, right? Before was Latin throughout. Now, for me, selfishly speaking, that would be easier because, that's the closest to my language. If everybody spoke Latin, much easier to understand in English for me. So yeah, bring it on. But that will not be considered a true tradition for too many reasons. First of all, because other churches that are as old as Catholicism, and talking about Eastern Orthodoxy, changed to vernaculars, almost right away, simply because most folks did not understand Latin or Greek. And I'm talking about the Slavs, the Russians, for instance. You cannot make the same claim if you're talking about the Greco-Roman world, because if you really want to go to the truth, you better, in my mind, at least read the text in the languages in which the text was either written or spoken about. That's my take on it. Yeah. And so if you make any type of traditionalist claim and say, well, in the past, everything was, the same from the beginning. Okay? If that is the claim, well, the least you can do is make sure you master at least one of the three languages spoken at a time. Now, if the Bible or the Talmud was written in the United States, you could say, well, the official language is English. But then you might want to expand on Spanish, for instance, and maybe some other minority language. So if you use that argument for the Bible, you could say, well, the official language in Judea was Latin. It was the Roman Empire. Huh. And yet, most people around that, the officials spoke Latin, of course, but Greek was really the language that was considered the lingua franca. On top of that, though, Aramaic was the ethno-cultural language. So and if you want to pick, at least pick one of those three, I would say. And if you don't master that, you better want to read it in the mother language that's the closest to at least one of those three. So for Latin, you can pick Italian or Spanish, I would say. Selfishly speaking, I would pick Italian because the Vatican is there and I'm Italian, but Spanish would be as good in comparison to, let's say, Romanian, that's a little more further away. And from Aramaic, you could speak Maltese or Arabic. You can even learn modern Hebrew, but there's a lot of neologism, and so you might miss some of that. And for the Greek, well, modern Greek will be pretty good. The problem with some interpretation that was closer to Protestantism is that most of that was, and still is, based on very modern version of the Bible, KJV, King James version, and etc. And they're all in English, which is great, but if you claim to go back to the purity of the tradition and you use a translation, and yet your claim is that, well, the church changed a lot of things, well, go back to the original one. That's the least you can do. And I think the Vatican II attempted to that because they invited, theologians from all over the world. So this is my take. I wasn't born, but that would be my take.
Well, so they introduced into the services specifically, or across the board, the local languages. So I don't know to what extent Catholics were speaking and writing in Latin outside of the services, outside of the rituals.
Well, Latin is still the official language of both the religion and of the country, of the state of the Vatican. It's the official. So all official documents are still written in Latin. So if you want to read them, you better learn Latin. But in practice, if you live there, Italian is the lingua franca, really. So most prelates and priests and bishops would use Italian, in conversations. And so if you, for instance, if you watch the Mass today, what the popes usually do, they might have bits and pieces in multiple languages, from Japanese to Arabic to English. But then once they read from the Bible, it's either Latin or Italian. Okay. So when they change the liturgy, then you no longer have the same language across the ritual. However, let me be clear here. One of the things that also separates, for the most part, I'm putting a lot of things in the same basket here. And again, I love this conversation, but I'm not a theologian. So my limited understanding is based on what I know to this point. One of the things that separates Catholicism from most Protestantism is we don't have sola scriptura. So we don't believe that the Bible is the only source
of authority
for authority. And so paradoxically, we say, who cares if you read the Bible in English? It's not the sole authority. But yet, if you want to make a claim, well, you guys are changing things. Let's go back to the roots. Well, the roots are Greek, Latin, and Aramaic. So that would be more of a... But there's always a danger, for instance, when you can make the same claim, or it's really not the same claim, but a similar claim to both Judaism and Islam. If you read the text in the original language, that is the truth, right? But what you're going to do if there is a discrepancy between the language of the culture and the language of the book, Latin and Italian are very, very similar, after 2,000 years still. And so if I'm saying a word in Latin, the likelihood that the meaning is preserved in Italian, and therefore I know how to use it, it's quite high. If instead, your everyday language is, let's say, French or whatever, and you need to read a Talmud, then you have to find a way to convey the modern meaning of the term. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But as a Catholic, well, I'm not a Catholic, but I was in Austria a few years ago. I've told this story several times. Innsbruck. And I was kind of just exploring the
Innsbruck,
city.
really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
We're like half an hour away from my hometown. Anyway.
Oh, really? Beautiful country, beautiful land. I was walking around town, a little village kind of town thing, and there was this door, this really old door. Yeah. And I didn't understand what it was, but people were going in and out of it. I'm like, oh, what's in there? So I opened it up, and it was this Catholic church that was kind of crammed in there. It wasn't a cathedral. It was kind of almost like it had a cave-like feeling to it. And I kind of walked in, and the service had started, and I didn't know what to do. So I sat down, and I just kind of witnessed the ceremony, the liturgy. And it was all in Latin. so far as I could tell. It wasn't in German.
Yeah.
And it was just a very, very, very profound experience for me. I just felt,
Oh, wow.
I felt a resonance through that, through participating in that. I felt the layers upon layers of worship in that room. It was just so profound for me. And I, after that, like I felt that if I crossed myself, like that would deal with a lot of like my anxiety, or it would really help me. So I started crossing myself a lot, and that was really helpful for me psychologically. And then I went back to the States, to Portland, Oregon, where I was living. I'm like, maybe this is for me. And so I went to Catholic Mass, and it was in English. And the guy was talking in English, and everything was in English. And it was so frustrating for me. I was just so frustrated by it. And because I understood what he was saying, and I didn't want to understand. I wanted that connection. Yeah, the mysticism. Or just the whole thing. So it vulgarized it. And so I could not access what I had been given access to when I was participating in the Latin rite. And so I understand that understanding is important for like knowledge and for the congregation on one level, but on another level, is church or worship really about understanding things? I mean, I understand like a homily or like some words of advice or speaking about the core doctrine about forgiveness and Jesus and understanding that as a part of the ceremony. But the ceremony itself, I don't know if the ceremony itself needs to be understood and communicated up here. And as a Protestant, it had always been communicated either through emotional music or through mental and moral teaching. And when I had a problem with Protestantism and I went through kind of a separation from that, it was because it felt like people were loving God like they would love a lover rather than participating in something finer and higher. It was more understandable and more earthly, and translating the divine into the earthly. I know it's more understandable, but that just doesn't seem to be the point to me. So I guess I'm throwing a lot of things out here, but to what degree is the liturgy turning into a local language good for the point of that liturgy?
Wow, this is beautiful. You really left me speechless. Well, let me start with a brief example. The same happens to us, and by us, I mean all us Europeans, when we listen to an English song. I'm not talking about something very profound, like a pop song.
Yeah.
The moment you understand the lyrics, the magic disappears. And, I think I mentioned to you before, I still am, quite a metalhead. And so something that you might find quite funny is that there's a lot of Catholic population that is really in tune with very hard, dark black metal with a lot of growl and face paint and whatnot, because there's a mystical liturgical element to that, and you don't quite understand all the lyrics, so there's a suspension of judgment, and I think you're spot on. Of course, this is kind of an analogy, and the same is, I think, dating too. How much you want to know your partner, how much you want to be surprised. I don't necessarily think that the Protestant attitude is a wrong one. In fact, I think it might be better than the average Catholic when you mention that they love God the same way they love a lover, a person. And think about, my name is David, and the Psalms are all about that, really. Even heartfelt, visceral love. Yes. So I like that, and I wish we had more of that in Catholicism. So that's one of the areas that I think I really don't like to compare and contrast, like a Protestant better, Catholic better, but it's something that we could learn. What I can give you as my metaphor is that, well, two. One slightly less disrespectful than the other, but we are among friends, so who cares? The first one is that I feel that attending a Protestant service, a sermon, is having the music sheet in front of you, but you're not playing it. Going to Mass is playing it, but you might not be able to read the letters, the notes. So in that sense, you are absolutely right. There's more explaining overall in the service itself. So if liturgy was all we had, at this point, I'm not sure if I would be spiritually attracted to Catholicism either, because because of my job and just my mindset, I need to eviscerate things. And so I love theology. I love, studying that stuff. And that's why I'm saying I'm not a theologian, because I'm not smart enough, honestly, with you. And I don't say this with, I don't know, an embellishing purpose. I think it's easier to study neuroscience than studying theology. You have better ways to verify the truth. It's just simple as that.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing that it's a little less respectful, I think that to a big extent, and that's at least how I experienced it, Protestantism is the social justice warrior movement of Christianity.
Yeah, it is.
It's a protest. So you're protesting about something which is ethically justified. And so when we think about how the SJW movement turned out to be in the last decades, well, it's horrifying. But for the most part, if you look back, there was a lot of things that were supposed to speak about in terms of social justice, war in Vietnam, racial equality, that I certainly believe was meant to be there because it was ethically justified. We needed it. And so if you make the claim, at least the origin of Protestantism were ethically justified to clear up the mess and the corruption in the church. So in that sense, was entirely justified. And so for hyper-traditionalists, which we call, sedevacantists, I'm not sure if you heard the term before, sedevacantism. Yeah, so sedevacantism are folks that believe that absolutely nothing after Vatican II is legit. And sedevacantism comes from sede vacante, which is Latin or Italian for empty seat. So there is no pope after. So you might think of Ratzinger, who just passed, bless his soul, as relatively more orthodox in comparison to Pope Francis, but nobody is orthodox enough for sedevacantism. And that position, I feel it's both theologically inconsistent, historically incorrect, and also pointless. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But one of the reasons that I disagree is that they consider Protestantism, for the most part, as like the worst that can happen. Like there's no ethical justification. It's a product of the devil. And I tend to disagree with that fully. If for no other reason that very similar debates happen, not just in the first 2 centuries of Christianity, but 2,500 years before the birth of Christ. Sadducees and Pharisees. Those debates are part of.
Yeah.
So if you eliminate the debate, you better do that if you can theologically or philosophically prove the inconsistency of the philosophical position, but you cannot just eliminate the debate for the sake of eliminating the debate, which is, in my view, what this position, the sedevacantic position, does for the most part.
Yeah.
But then from a perspective of more liberal Catholics, I might appear more orthodox because I do appreciate the need of not just watering down the liturgy. If that makes sense.
No, it does. It's I guess we're always living in tension with the past and the future too, and the present, and the process of updating culture is constant. One thing that you made me think of is that even though I do agree that even atheism is a sect of Protestantism, which is a sect of Christianity in a certain respect, just because it's a constant purging of extemporaneous belief from human experience, which I think Jesus was all about, getting to the core of things, getting to the truth, getting to love, getting to the essence of the faith and of the Bible. And I think that atheism, in a certain respect, not low-tier atheism, but just as a movement that we've seen over the course of the last 20, 30, 40 years, and even, since the scientific revolution and over the last few centuries, that has been incubated within Christianity, really does rely, just like liberalism relies on Christian assumptions of behavior and actually relies on Christian assumptions of humanity. It has a theology hidden inside of it, even though it's kind of purged, in this kind of Protestant way. We're going to take off the idols. We're going to clean things up.
Puritan.
Clean things up. Very Puritan. But what anchors Protestantism that is still connected to Christianity, as opposed to social justice, which is just kind of a very radical version of that, is that Protestantism has this movement inward towards self-perfection, clean your room, and my relationship to God is most important. And if you don't have that, then the social justice warrior mindset is more about, I need to change the world, and it's all this projection of history, and it's this very big way of thinking that obscures, personal development and can lose the anchor to personal responsibility. And that's why we see the horrors of various different social movements going off the rails, such as, communism, the French Revolution, is because these people completely lost the plot because they were thinking in purely like rationalist terms or just socioeconomic terms, and exploding their ego onto that level and losing connection to that. I don't know where I was going with that thought, but that's just something that you made me think of.
Yeah, I think you're fully, spot on. I mentioned it from time to time. If I were to pick a religion in the absence of a more firm belief, I would pick atheism for too many reasons. First of all, because I do indeed believe that it is a form of, there's a cultic element in that. There's a ritualistic element. There is, if nothing else, it can serve as a substitute for religion. It makes us feel, and it makes us feel that we know more than we actually do know. But the reason why, I mentioned this before, when I talk to my students about the scientific method and research, I always say, if it's a good place to start because you don't take anything for granted.
Or you try not to, you endeavor to.
You try not. You might argue, well, this is more of an agnostic position than an atheist. Sure. At that level, the reason why I'm using it, I think it's more semantics. Simply, you don't want to use in a scientific method, if you want to prove the hypothesis to be true or false, that you don't want to take any variables that you did not previously examine. So unless you have the proof that one of these variables is true, please don't accept anything. And so in that sense, I value atheism. And I also value atheism simply because this is more personal, not really theological or philosophically profound. Some of the most profound people I had a chance to work with were atheists, and they were extremely open and keep searching. So they were not interested in either this kind of pseudo-modernists, militant atheism, the usual one, the Dawkins, the Harris, etc. Hitchens, although he has a beautiful voice, so maybe I can spare Hitchens. Dennett, and any solid philosopher will have no problem really, unpacking their very poorly founded claims about pretty much anything. And yet, I think I mentioned to you before, I have this big red flag that waves more when I'm more scared of religious extremists than atheist extremists. Maybe because I feel I can deal with atheism better. It's closer to my environment professionally. Yes. I think I'm one of the very few, scientists in my team that it has some sort of belief. Some of them don't really spend too much time thinking about these type of topics, not because they're superficial, but they're just so busy in doing their research. But I assume that most of them are either atheists or agnostic. So it feels familiar to me nowadays, as opposed to more of a religious extremist that I feel I'm ill prepared because we speak such a different language. But that said, I fully agree with you on the fact that, let me put it this way. Atheism as a fact was part of human history since the beginning of time, I would say, rightfully so. But the turn it took, you said right, French Revolution, I would probably prepone that like 200 years, like Humanism, 1400, Florence. Which again, back then was justified. It was an atheism that stemmed from the fact that we at the time they want to better incorporate, traditional knowledge. And keep in mind, to this day, even in Italian, we say modern religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and ancient religion, Roman, religion, Greek religion, etc. So we still view that. You say, well, Catholicism has 2,100 years of history. Yeah, but still a modern religion. So does Judaism. And so if you really want to be a traditionalist, go back, right? But the truth is that they didn't stem from anything either. So, if you go back to Canaanite religions and pre-monotheistic, Sinai, Mesopotamian culture, there's a lot of affinity on that. And so I think it was justified in 1400 to have this open-minded set of assumption about, let's see if what we believe makes sense and how much overlap there is with Aristotelian knowledge, Islamic knowledge at the time, Jewish, Talmudic, and Kabbalah knowledge. So, but the French Revolution was like, just toss really all the babies, literally speaking, with the baby water, with the bath water. So
you mentioned humanism. Do you know kind of you kind of said it within a historical context.
Yes.
So what is humanism?
So in general, in Europe, by humanism, we mean the philosophical movement of 1450 in Tuscany, Florence, and from that spread throughout Europe. So nothing to do with what we call post-humanism for the last 150 years. So humanists are people that were, to a big extent, I can mention a few authors. Pico della Mirandola, for instance, one of the primary philosopher of the time, and more modern ones that kind of base their assumption either as a criticism or expansion on that. Think of Giambattista Vico, for instance. Most of them were Italians, and to some minor extent, Giordano Bruno. So humanism as putting humanity at the center, which was, you could make the claim, the philosophical or intellectual equivalent of what Galileo was doing in astrophysics, or science in general.
But so by human, they didn't mean the hominoid descendant of apes. They didn't think of it as a biological category. There was some sort of idea of what a human is, or at least an attitude towards what a human is. Like what is that? To put the human. So
this is the part that I have problem answering, because, like, for instance, I don't think it's just something that I feel. I think it's historically true. I actually never ever experienced any conflict between science and religion within Catholicism ever. I never met any Catholic that would even question evolutionary theory. And so this separation between the biologistic view and the spiritual view, it's something that was very foreign to me as a Catholic. Why would you ever claim, not to agree with that? Now, this will not be so, and that's why I have a hard time answering the question, because Darwin did not exist in the 1400s.
Yeah.
And so to make the leap, are human beings descendant of apes? Well, you cannot make the claim, historically speaking, because it was not in the making there. But even if it was, I don't think it would constitute any serious problem to the theology of the time.
Okay. But there is still a theology there, even though there's not a God at the center. There's a human, humanity, humanism. So what is what is that thing that they're calling human?
Well, historically speaking, the one that I was referring to, humanism simply wants to put the human being at the center of creation, not to make it God, but simply not to make assumption on the same level of hierarchy that was previously the justification for the place of the man in the world. So in other words, does the fact that the earth is no longer the center of the universe change things or not? No, theologically speaking, it does not. But let's make sure that we don't confuse things. So that level of humanism was actually, paradoxically speaking, more theologically correct. Humanism was the application of the Catholic disdain for pride. Listen, guys, you're just humans. You're not gods. So humanism wants to put you back in your proper place. You're just one part of the universe. You're not the masters of the universe, which is very different from the way humanism and transhumanism is nowadays, which is actually making people God, or making them believing they are God.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, up to one point. And I feel with transhumanism, computers might be gods, or artificial intelligence might be God.
Well, yeah. But okay, so just to try to sketch out the development from this historical humanism that you're talking about, and then posthumanism that you mentioned, like the last 150 years, maybe the liberal humanism. So
yes,
this older form of humanism was, I'm just kind of guessing here, based on the scientific method or Aristotelian kind of attitude towards nature. We're going to think things through. We're going to base our beliefs on what we can know and what we can understand, and what we can't know and can't understand, we're not going to pretend to know or understand.
Correct.
So kind of a humility of knowledge, of epistemic humility.
Yes.
Okay.
And keep in mind that, I really, please bear with me. I always like to talk about words, but humility really means going back to the earth, as in soil, humilitas in Latin. So it's really biology, and that's why it's not inconsistent with, theology. Yeah. You literally came from matter. So you better understand matter better. Okay.
Yeah. Is there I guess we can look this up offline, but humility and humanity. Humanity comes from no humanity.
No, this is a false equivalency. It's a false friends. Humanity comes from homo, which is the human being, and humilitas. Now, between homo and humilitas, there might be something, but keep in mind.
But man was created from the dust, so you can understand that there would be metaphorical.
Yes. I'm always afraid to make that claim. Because the way. So one of the common mistake that you can make in historical linguistics is to assume that the vowels override the consonants. So with homo and humilitas, you have that hum sound, but in ancient alphabets, you did not have vowels. So you had to be careful not to, they got kind of, just because it sounds like a duck and walks like a duck, it has to be a duck. Maybe it's a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So it might be, it would be nice if that would be the case. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. It's poetic, but
the same way as between the homo in Latin and homo in Greek. Homo in Greek is same, versus homo in Latin, it's human. HOMO.
Oh.
Yeah, false equivalency. So
okay.
So if you want to say a sentence such as the same man, you would say homo.
Okay, but so homo sapien and homosexual are two different uses
Correct.
of the word
completely different. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Every conversation is just a wealth of new knowledge with you, Dave.
Thanks to you.
So, I have an idea where I want to go in the conversation, just to let the audience know that. But so that humanism that we were talking about, kind of epistemic humility, is it fair enough to just say that's kind of the foundation of that, or what their starting point and what the work they did? So what is this kind of post-humanism that you were talking about over the last 150 years, this modernism?
Yes, I think one author just came to mind, Yuval Harari. He's an Israeli author, philosopher, Harari, Harari. And post-humanism, I'm really going to simplify things here. Not because I don't want to insult your knowledge, but because it takes forever. Yeah. It's simply the assumption that, men, as in human beings, are definitely better than a sky god that never existed to begin with, but they're really not that useful, and they will become less and less useful as we progress with artificial intelligence and computers. So post-humanism is the idea that, or transhumanism, that there's a debate between which term means what. We were supposed to put ourselves at the center of the universe because we had to replace God, since God did not exist. But nowadays, we just need to, leave more room for computers because we are just not that capable.
Of what?
So that's of anything, pretty much.
Okay. So we're a stain, we're a flaw, we're
and that's where that's the difference I would say between posthumanism and transhumanism. Transhumanism suspended judgment in their own judgment, because it's pointless to talk about morality since it's made up stuff anyway. So, stop crying about your role in the world. Computer is just better at every task. So you're not that valuable as a thing anymore. Deal with it.
Oh, so this is really utilitarian then. The only thing metric that matters is some sort of efficiency, but efficiency for what? What's the purpose there?
And that's where you go back to, David Hume, and you go back to, you said it rightly, you say to productivity. And your value is predicated upon how much you can produce in the smaller amount of time with the least amount of expenses. And in that sense, you don't really need to be a philosopher to understand it. Any computer is faster than us.
Yeah. Well,
but then the danger of that is that you might, if you, psychologically speaking, if you cannot deal with that. So in other words, if a person with not solid philosophical understanding reads a book by Harari and finds himself in desperation, my whole castle just fell apart. I have no meaning. There's no meaning to life. My life has no meaning. The danger is that you will revert to a sentimentalist version of spirituality, where you just make stuff up just to make yourself feel better, but without any solid core. That's the danger I see. Yeah. Once you push on one end, and the end is very much materialistic, utilitarian, and nihilistic, then the risk is that you're going to be bouncing back to kind of very embellished, floral, sentimentalist version of spirituality that makes you spiritually weak.
Huh. Okay,
that's how I see it.
Where I wanted to go, actually. So this posthumanism has a lack of it has a lack of addressing certain human needs. Unless you're a certain type of human.
Those needs are irrelevant, I would say. It's not that they fail to address them, they're just irrelevant. We are just here by accident. We won't really leave a mark. And whatever mark we leave, it's nowhere as profound and meaningful as the mark that automated machines will leave, because they're already capable to do much more than us. Okay. So if there's anything of value to us, is the fact that we started the process. So if you don't want to go to the fully nihilistic view, so well, at least we were the one that invented computers after all. Okay, that's not too different than comparing theistic and deistic version of reality. So yeah, sure, we are the God that created a computer, but we take no effect, posthumously in the way computers, once they're born, they're going to do their thing. And in fact, most likely will kill us all type of thing. So it's a very, I don't know, steampunky outlook.
Okay.
In that sense, but there's a sentimentalist value in that, I feel. Like if you read some of these authors, there is some sort of, I don't know, nihilistic Isaac Asimov feeling to it, where, it's, here I have a good comparison. I'm going to make this comparison, and this will really make your audience, scary, because whenever you mention his name, people are just scary. Julius Evola, the Italian philosopher. You might not have heard of his name. In English, very often, his name is rendered as Julius Evola, Evola.
Okay. Yeah.
One of his most
books. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
One of his most famous work is Riding the Tiger, or Revolt Against the Modern World. We talk about the 30s, 40s.
Okay.
And one of his arguments, and again, I'm not defending his arguments, but it's a very similar argumentation here. That so he was, for lack of a better term, a traditionalist with a capital T, a Italian traditionalist, and he considered. I mean, this is really. I'm giving his biography in the form of a meme, just for the sake of time, but he considered both Hitler and Mussolini as really not right-wing enough. They're really not, like, kind of. The true traditionalists will get rid of everything that came really to be for the last 3,000 years. There's really nothing of significance in those 3,000 years in modern history. Nothing. Certainly not those desert religions. So he was really extremist in that sense. But one thing he said is, like it or not, we lost the war. The right wing lost the war. Our values are long gone. And even the last stronghold of traditional values, Catholicism, which we completely despise, but at least has some semblance of tradition, it will disappear, because that's where things are. So we can only learn how to stand on the ruins. We can no longer be in charge of reality, but the least we can do is develop some core here to be able to stand on the ruins. And his view, which was not really correct, in terms of historical study of religion, but he claimed that, well, this is just the Kali Yuga, is the darkest age that humanity will go through. So we're all gonna die, and eventually, as a purifying fire, the world will be reborn 4,000 years from now, whatever.
Okay.
So the ones that were able to stand despite of the destruction of the world and the machines taking over will be the one that will I wouldn't say gain benefit in the afterlife, but prove themselves.
Okay.
So that view was kind of similar to Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings. His emphasis on the fact that too much progressive development of the machines will destroy nature, destroy tradition. There's many scenes in The Lord of the Rings where Saruman actually employs orcs and this piece of machinery to destroy the trees and the sacred forest. So, and Tolkien was Catholic, of course.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that I'm not drawing comparison between Tolkien and Evola and Harari, no, but you can see where this is headed. The world will fall apart if you believe in that narrative. So there's going to be either people that will become too superficially spiritual by becoming weak sentimentalists, or you'll become a hero. Yeah. But the only way to become a hero is to sacrifice yourself and stand on the ruins.
Well, okay, yeah. I mean, that would be the good here. I guess the villain would be the person who just decides to accelerate the whole process and demolish everything and go to a war of the wills kind of thing. So you can either sacrifice yourself or you can sacrifice everybody else to prove yourself. Yeah,
but here's the thing. Here's the problem. In the traditional narratives you find in movies, the villain is at least to some extent aware that he is a villain, and I'm going to do the bad thing to destroy the world too. Versus in transhumanism, it's more like it doesn't make sense. It's like Nietzsche, it's beyond good and evil. I'm not doing bad things. There's a natural course of events. I'm not doing anything bad because there's nothing good. It's just what it is.
Yeah. And so Evola, what's the content of his human? Because we're always talking about, like, there's always this image of the human as it was or as it should be that's being lost or needs to be proven. In all of these, in every religion and everything that we're talking about. So in Evola's kind of image, like what makes the man?
I would say the short answer will be a trial makes the man. So spiritual trial, a spiritual quest makes the man. But what's interesting about Evola, well, two things that kind of prove how mistaken he was in interpreting those things. So one of the biggest criticisms he had for the Nazis was that, and in that sense, according to him, they were not right-wing enough. It's because they were biologists. In his mind, talking about biological race was just as stupid. Biologically speaking, did not make sense, but also spiritually speaking, did not make sense. And he wrote a lot about the nonsensical argument that being an Aryan had any biological validity. It was it's just a term to define novelty. But to a big extent, he was considered an anti-Semite too, because in his mind, there were different moral characters according to races. So you cannot condone Evola just because he was not a biological racist. He was a spiritual racist, and in that sense, he was just as bad. But at the same time, in comparison to everything around him, which was very much utilitarian, nihilistic materialist, he was one of the few within the right wing, because I think it's fair to define him as right wing, a thinker that never believed there was anything biologically speaking valid to claim that there was this race that was superior to the other one, at the very least. So what makes a human? Well, the spiritual core, the spiritual hierarchy.
Yeah.
Now, a thing you might find interesting is that, and this I think is relevant to the conversation, because, so what are the components of a human being? Well, in that sense, he was very much traditionalist, back to not just Aristotle, but to Moshe ben Maimon in Judaism, and to Avicenna in Islam, and all the way back to Socrates and Plato and whatnot. So he viewed there is a European spirituality and a non-European spirituality. The European spirituality is pretty much the Indo-European spirituality. So Hinduism, Buddhism, ancient paganism, the Roman gods, the Greek gods. And then you have a non-European spirituality, which can be Taoistic, can be Semitic, etc., etc. So Judaism, for instance, is non-Indo-European. The Roman gods are. Now, here's the mistake. The mistake is to assume that they're completely different and separated. There's no overlap between Indo-European culture, which is, easy to prove false. The second mistake is to confuse and confound linguistics with ethnicity and culture. Example, during the British domination, I would say that the official language throughout the Indian subcontinent was English. Think about us. I'm speaking English, but I'm not ethnoculturally English or British for that matter. So that is also a mistake. And the other thing is also to ignore, I think purposely so, how much overlap there is in modern, by modern I mean in the last 3,000 years, history of religion. Example, not many people, I would assume, on this side of the ocean, know that the Buddha is a saint in Roman Catholicism. Buddha is. And he's also a saint in Eastern Orthodoxy. So in terms of what makes a human, it's his spiritual element, so his spirit, his soul, and then, of course, the body. But in the biggest scheme of things, the body is really what carries the soul. So it's valuable as a result of that.
Yeah.
So whatever productivity the body does, it's not really that relevant. So that's kind of the anti-transhumanistic version of things. So yeah, sure, the computer will be much better at performing every task. But at the end of the day, it does not matter.
Because it doesn't have a soul or a spirit.
Correct.
Of any quality. Will there ever be an AI that the Catholic Church?
So let's separate these two things, though, because soul and spirit are very, very distinct. So, and again, this really depends on what theological form you take. But you could say, so aside from the etymology, but one thing that we might want to debate is that, okay, it's whatever you want to call it, the transcendental element. Is that, first of all, eternal, will survive biological death, and B, is it personal? Or it just diffuses, once you die. In other words, will I remember myself with my memories? So in that sense, I would say that computers outperform human beings, even in that area. Once you have a file, you put it on the internet, stays there literally forever, even if you destroy the matter that created in the first place. You have a JPEG or an MP4 video, you might be able to see the video, but the data is still there forever. You can copy it, you can do whatever you want. So in that sense, computers and AI do indeed possess a soul, if you want to define soul with that thing. Yeah. I don't buy it at all, the fact that you can make the comparison, because, well, even for the simple reason that someone has to access the soul in that sense. You cannot project a video unless you have a screen of some sort. So you have the data, but to make the data usable, you need to have some sort of interface. Also, the computer did not create that for itself. And even if you want to say, well, yeah, now, but in only 5-10 years from now, computers are pretty much self-managing themselves, sure, but the algorithm was still created at first, at least by a different form of knowledge. So no, I don't believe that. I don't believe that AI constitutes a threat in that sense in any way.
In what way specifically?
I don't think the machines will take over the world anytime soon, ever.
Okay. Go back just a bit. Evola split religions into European and non-European. For whatever reason, he was wrong or right. What was the category that he was shaping? What was he saying about this set of religions and this other set of religions? Like, were there certain assumptions within this European religion?
Absolutely.
And what's the core that he was using to organize everything around?
Yeah, so he and again, it's a long story, but heroism would probably be the category. Indo-European religions are heroic religions.
Okay. Yeah.
And Semitic religions, with the big exception of Islam, though, and I'll explain on that. So he had a lot of disdain for Catholicism. Well, not Catholicism itself, but okay. Let me answer one question first because I get lost otherwise. So Indo-European religion, heroic, as in the way to get closer to God or the gods was by displaying an heroic militaristic virtue. You go to Valhalla if you are still standing in battle or if you are killed in battle, but you don't refuse to fight. You never, show the other cheek in the European religion. Okay? You either kill or you must be killed. That's the way to approach God. It's not condoning violence. It's self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
In his view, which again is also historically inaccurate, there is no such thing as self-sacrifice in Christianity or Judaism. All those martyrs that decided to self-sacrifice for their faith against the will of the emperor, we're just dumb, his view. So heroism defines these two things, which again, aside from ignoring all the Jewish tradition of the kings, of the battles, of David, the whole Talmud really, which plenty of battles, and bloodshed if you want to. So I would say that it's much more similar to the Roman or the Scandinavian counterpart. But also the other mistake he made, there are several mistakes. The other mistake is to claim that one is older than the other one, that Europeans are much, much older than anything that, came from the Middle East. Well, based on our current knowledge, we all came from the same core. I mean, it's a non sequitur for that. And there are a few other mistakes.
But so was it his disdain for this so-called non-European religion was that he had an anxiety about like the weakening of man or the weakening of this heroic?
Yes.
And with that stated, is that what he was seeing happening? That everything in the modern life was eroding the strength or the heroism of man, and there's no returning to. Yes,
he viewed the Soviet Union and the United States as the epitome of this fall of the modern world.
Okay,
they claim to be coming from opposite ends, but they're both materialists. They both reject God, as in the Soviet Union rejected God to make the humanism become the new communist man, so to speak. The proletariat.
And he disliked the communist man because it was just the same. There was this kind of disapparated. Everybody's just a part of community.
Correct.
There's no individual there. There's no heroes. Everybody's bogged down in bureaucracy and following orders, and nobody has a chance to stand up or stand out. Because that would be anti-communist and in practice.
Yes.
And then from the U.S. point of view, this materialistic...
He called them Plutonians, so obsessed with money, and money is, again, materialistic. So, he considered, they're just two different variations of the same corrupting element. And in his view, the corrupting element entered Europe through the Middle East, which again is a big claim to make. Yeah. But you could see in his distorted view how that has a inner consistency, right?
Yeah.
Europe or India or Tibet really is the last stronghold of the old tradition, the primeval tradition.
Yeah.
So the tradition that was not corrupted starting 4,000 years ago, and then everything else is encroaching to make us weak. And not just that, but we praise weakness. We say, turn the other cheek, love your enemy. Yeah. It's completely bogus.
Forgive.
Which again, it's forgive, which is also BS, because there are plenty of examples. Like the Roman virtus, okay, the virtue in the Roman, which is one of the basic elements of both the theology and the liturgy of the Roman religion. Virtus can be translated as virtue, but it's a compound of forgiveness, very, very similar to the Christian forgiveness, as well as virility. The term vir means man, virility means also, etymologically speaking, the tree of life, but also means to forgive. So very, very similar. To claim that the Romans were all about conquering and not forgiving is just not true, theologically speaking.
Yeah.
The Roman army, the Roman constitution, sure, the state, but the Roman religion was not that different, in fact. Huh. And the same can be said about, let's say, Germanic paganism. You have Thor, of course, you have Odin, you have Loki, but you have Baldur. And Baldur, it's you could say, is the Nordic Christ, for lack of a better term.
What was his message or his act?
It's very, very similar to Jesus's one. Again, here's what I'm not doing. I'm not doing what a lot of very poorly theologically grounded people might say. Well, Christianity are just reinvention of paganism. No, not at all. Okay. The similarities are not there because one took over the other, but because they're based on the same archetype. They're true no matter what. And it doesn't make sense to claim that one is an evolution and the other one, because that will assume that there is a linear time. In Catholicism, for instance, we say, well, Jesus was, but he was at the beginning of time. Yeah. So the fact that he was incarnating the Christ happened at a very specific time in history.
Yeah.
but his ontological nature, his existence predates history. So to say, well, you adjusted Christmas to fit into the Saturnalia. Well, sure. And so what you're trying to prove here, all religions assume that for instance, if you ever travel in my hometown, okay, so we have the modern monastery that's about, I don't know, 800, 900 years old. But before that monastery, there was an older monastery. It's about 2,000 years old. And before that, there was, a Roman temple, a Vedic temple. So this idea of juxtaposing Middle Eastern religion to European, spirituality, it's a very modern thing to do, which I think stands for two things. One is the remnant of humanism, reducing everything to a psychologized version of notion. We made up the image of God. And the other thing is a byproduct of nationalism in mid-1800 Europe. So you're Italian, you believe in the Italian God. You're German, you believe in the German God. You're Jewish, you believe in the Jewish God. Yes, but that doesn't make sense historically speaking. To confuse and confine.
Well, okay. Equating or not equating or improperly equating Balder to Christ aside, what was Balder's act or his the message that he was bringing into?
You could say that he was the forgiver. He was bringing peace and forgiveness and love, I would say, for the most part. And he's the archetypical opposite of Loki. A lot of people compare Balder and Thor. Sorry, Loki and Thor. But Hollywood aside, I think that the best analogy would be between Balder and Loki.
Loki being
the trickster. The trickster.
Accuser,
Correct. Yes.
Going back to Job there. So that kind of that archetype.
Yes. Okay. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And before we leave, I keep on wanting to say Ebola, and I have to stop myself. Evola, Islam. The heroic. What did he see in Islam as the heroic archetype?
Yeah, so that's another problem here, and I think it's fair enough for me to speak about that. I think I mentioned to you that some of my wife's family is Muslim, so I had the privilege to learn quite a bit about that. So I'm not just speaking, out of hearsay. I hope. Again, I'm not a theologian, but so there are two things about that period. First of all, in the specific time frame, there was a lot of tension for what eventually became the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. We're talking about World War II, right? So Israel as a state did not exist, but the anti-Semitic, right-wing races was definitely there throughout Europe, and so. For the right or wrong reasons, and by right and wrong, I don't mean morally, but in terms of interpretation, what they think they were doing, Islam was perceived as the rightful evolution of paganism that started to liberate itself from the dust of the desert. So there was more heroism in Islam. There was, in other words, the main thing is that, well, who was Jesus if you are not a believer? Well, perhaps a son of a carpenter, maybe a good, philosopher, but he was definitely not a warrior. Sure, you have some elements here and there in your destruction of the temple. You get mad.
Like, bringing a sword, kind of.
Right. Yeah, sure. Yes. And by the way, this is also ignorance because the whole, monastic tradition of Christ the King, Christ the Savior is very heroic. So to claim that, but thinking of a warrior is not the first attributes that one would usually attribute to Christ, versus Muhammad was definitely a warrior. And so that fitted in this kind of distorted notion of continuation of paganism. And on top of that, since the Allies were more prone to rightfully defend the rights of Jews in Europe, well, what is left for Hitler and Mussolini was to embrace the other part. And so Mussolini became you can find, I don't remember how to translate that in English correctly, but he was the defender of Islam in the world. He was given the sword of Islam. If you just Google it, Mussolini, the sword of Islam. Yeah.
Really?
So he was
like he attributed that to himself, or he was given that?
No. He was given that. But who was the first king to give to him? But anyway, he was representative of the Muslim tradition in the Middle East because of the similarities. And again,
Interesting.
I really don't know how to make this thing together, but it's a historical fact, which was eventually used. I don't know if fully if there was a awareness of that or not by people like Evola to say that, well, yes, sure, there is an evolution and Islam is still a religion of the book, but at the same time it's more heroic than those Catholics or Jews that are just weak. There's more of a heroic component in Islam than there is in Christianity or
from
Judaism.
Evola's point of view, why was Mussolini not far right enough? Like, what was Mussolini's like failure?
Well,
to
there are personal
Evola's
reasons.
seemingly impossible standard, it seems like.
Yeah, yes. I mean, there's a lot of things. And again, one ought not to badmouth someone whom he never met in person, but there is this big, debate whether Evola was a real nobleman or not, whether his noble title were just made up, because it's anyway. Yeah. One of the reasons that because Mussolini had, I mean, he had quite a bit of preferences for a certain aspect of Judaism that Evola despised, and aside from a personal reason, his mistress was Jewish as well. And again, one of the difference between Mussolini and Hitler was that Hitler attempted to reason using his really troublesome brain. I don't think Mussolini even attempted it. Mussolini really reasoned with an organ much lower in the body.
Oh yeah.
And so I think that's kind of a stereotype, but that's the primary thing. So who cares about? It didn't make sense to think about races. If someone is hot, it's hot, man.
Yeah,
that's
pretty
much the gist of it.
The machismo,
absolutely,
masculine
absolutely.
will.
Which doesn't justify at all what happened in Italy afterwards with the racial laws. But to be fair, a lot of the Italkim, the Italian Jews, were very fond of fascism at first, because fascism appeared to be doing what a healthy secularized society ought to do. So not separating people in classes based on their religion, getting rid of the overarching power of the Vatican, giving everybody a chance, including Jews and other atheists and agnostics. And so I think to some extent they were full into that. And so Evola, said, well, if you do that you're not really, a man enough.
Okay, yeah, all right. But so from a certain point of view, fascism appeared before it blossomed to be kind of egalitarian and elitist, so that it would allow for circulation of the elites. It would bring things more back to meritocratic standards of judgment and reward in society.
Meritocracy, by being beaten up, it's a big statement to make. It's like, I will force my meritocracy on you, otherwise you're going to be beaten up. That's really a big statement to make.
Yeah, okay.
But at least, superficially speaking, Mussolini indeed was a socialist. And he started his career actually in Tyrol, where I'm from, when Tyrol was still part of the Austrian Empire. And he refused actually to, it's kind of funny, he refused to be enlisted in the Italian army, escaped to Switzerland. So he wasn't really, he never enlisted. Eventually, later on, he took part in some battles and got hurt. But he was definitely a socialist. So at least on paper, he appeared to appeal to this need for egalitarianism. And the other thing, which is really important, is that until that time, there was no conflict between one's feeling of European pride, even nationalistic pride, and being Jewish. There was no contrast between since the Aryan concepts and mythology did not exist. Yeah. And nobody really seriously believed in that. There was no conflict in identifying oneself as a proud Italian, proud heirs of the Roman Empire, the Roman gods, while going to the synagogue. There was not. Okay. The Italian Jewish community is one of the oldest in the world. Considerably before the destruction of the temple in Rome. So as you can see, they're one of the oldest. So see that the political stupidity of that as well, to try to enforce racial laws. Like, dude, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But you can see how the whole mystique was appealing, and a lot of people were I don't know, in shock, I would say.
When it began to become authoritarian, the fascism specifically.
I think the authoritarian part was always there.
People wanted that at a certain time. Don't we turn to that as political bodies during certain times of unrest? Or
it's the usual saying: strong people make good time make weak people create bad times.
Yeah,
it's the usual thing.
Yeah. Okay, so going way back to another part of the conversation. We were talking about Catholicism, and I kind of shared a mystical experience.
Yes.
Right? So from your point of view as a neurobiologist...
Neuroscientist. But anyway, yeah.
There's a difference for me in my thinking between like faith and belief and spiritual experience. And I think they're all necessary components to even something out and like spiritual experience for me is the core of, spirituality is the core of religion, but religion takes that spirituality and makes it social. So it brings in the whole human, and then it also makes it, through a belief structure, it makes it kind of like a worldview. So I'm living within kind of a significant life. My life has significance. So the spiritual experience is brief, it's bright, but it needs to be concretized. It can't happen all the time. It needs to be related. And, and then the religion helps with that and then also forms a community. And then I don't want to and then faith is the practice and the returning, the internal practice of exercising and perfecting myself in relationship to the religious understanding and then the spiritual experience, and how I feel in the world and all of that. So from a neuroscientist point of view, I just wanted to get into the conversation of your belief or how we can use the tools that you've discovered and, or the insights and the knowledge that you have to inform ourselves about, faith, belief, spirituality, and that whole domain. And then I guess we can kind of plug that into the conversation because we've always been talking about the human and these different kind of versions of what a human is through all these different thinkers and movements. So, I'm assuming that speaking about neuroscience and spirituality would kind of give us or help us formulate what a human is.
Right? Yeah, I shall hope so I don't waste my career finding things that are not relevant. But that is really interesting. So neuroscience is kind of a meaningful pursuit or part of your search for meaning in a broader sense than just a career or something you find fascinating, but this is a meaningful endeavor for you, or almost a spiritual or religious endeavor, like it's a part of it. Okay. Yes. Yeah. It's the usual saying, psychologists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists want to be priests, rabbis, or imams, and in that sense, I'm lucky because I get to do the research, so spending time in the lab and do the neuroscience research, but I'm also a clinician. So as a psychologist, I can talk to people. And I think that keeps my balance to some extent. Because if I were just to talk to people and not have enough time to spend researching whether what I'm preaching is true, then I'll feel I'll be on shaky grounds. And conversely, if I only spend time in the lab, but you couldn't see a direct application of what I'm finding, then I say, what's the point? Besides, again, pride, which is it's a sin, man. So here's the thing. To answer your question, yes, I feel this is my calling, and I feel that I'm, to the best of my knowledge, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. And this feels good because I can incorporate some of the bad traits of being human. So it's better to acknowledge our weaknesses and our sinful nature, as in, could I claim that I'm completely detached from the needs of appreciation? No. But between receiving a like on Facebook and having a citation on, let's say, academia, the second one at least has some sort of meaning for others. So that's how I justify myself.
Yeah.
So being praised for things that are, I would say, intrinsically good is better than being praised for the sake of being praised.
Okay.
It's still not the optimal thing, that you should always try for a more humble self and reduce your ego need for praise. But in the end of that.
Well, I mean, the praise is a signifier of doing something useful or contributing in a meaningful way.
Yes.
Good feedback.
Now, absolutely. Now, I'm lucky, and I say that with kind of an open heart, that the things I'm researching provide more and more, let me use the term, proof for the existence of God than the opposite. Now, this statement is only partially true. I don't think that there's ever going to be any scientific full proof of the existence of God or the afterlife. There are different magisteria, different ways to approach reality. But in my view, what I'm studying makes my belief more likely to be based on truth than otherwise. And that's a comforting thing. And I think I mentioned to you before that I went, through different stages in my belief toward a completely disbelief, unbelief, and so science brought me back to faith. Let me put it that way. And I would say that there are several reasons for that. But to keep the conversation short, I would say two main areas. One is the clinical area, and the other one is just the lab area. Starting with the lab area, there's tons of scientific evidence, for instance, on brain activity when a person is meditating or praying. And one of the most fascinating things is that processes occur that are usually perceived to be opposite. So in everyday conceptual awareness, you're like a DSLR camera. So you can either zoom in or zoom out. So the more you zoom out, the better you recognize the pattern of the panorama. And the more you zoom in, the more you are focused on the detail. All right. So in general, you could say that if you are drinking coffee, you can be, in the absence of other pathologies, if you drink coffee, you're very focused on the detail. You're task-oriented, you get to the point. If instead you're drinking alcohol, you're more relaxed and you might see things more, in general, but you miss the detail, okay?
Yeah.
And this is a metaphor, of course, but from a scientific standpoint, there are neural areas in the brain that are more focused on kind of focusing on the detail, understanding the rationality, and putting things in order and calculating them. And those things are usually in the cortex, the prefrontal cortex especially. And there are things that are more heartfelt, you'd say. They're more, I wouldn't say instinctual, although those parts of the brain are also the first ones to be developed. So it makes sense from the perspective of neurobiology of development. If a person prays or meditates, those two areas are fully combined. So you are in a dreamlike state where your dreams are not less cognitively focused or precise, they're even more enhanced in their precision. And yet they're more holistically tolerant and open-minded, which is a fascinating thing. And so this is just one area that I found fascinating.
So,
and again, go for it.
So, human beings somehow developed this thing that we call prayer meditation. And maybe we can do the evolutionary argument that the societies that stumbled upon these practices were able to get a little bit more ahead, or that led to, greater developments or something like that. There's something useful. There's something useful about this thing we call prayer and meditation. But it came about, it's something you do intentionally. It's something that you teach your children, right? I guess maybe we can find it in the wild. I guess if you just had a kid and the kid does that state, or maybe the brain in its development at certain times is just always in a prayerful state. Who knows? I don't know. But what is that thing called prayer? Like, what is that? It's an intentional act that we do where we're focusing our attention in a certain way or on certain things in order to achieve a certain kind of brain phase, right? So what is that? what is prayer? Like when in the lab, how do you guys study that? Like you tell somebody to do this thing, or they've learned this thing that they do. Like what is that thing that they're doing? What is it cognitively, intentionally that we do that we unlock or access that brain state?
All right, let me just start by saying that the premise that you attribute to an evolutionary biology perspective is in itself wrong.
Oh, good.
And or at least this interpretation is wrong. So what is wrong? To assume that one day, humanity stumbled upon meditation or prayer, and they found it useful, just as they stumble upon fire or the wheel, and they put into action. They figure out, well, this is more helpful than not. Well, to make that statement, I have on the fact that the least you can do is being humble enough to say, well, I don't know if what came first. Maybe meditation came before man, as in human. You don't know. Maybe prayer existed independently of a physical body. But even if you don't want to go that route, which is more mystical and esoteric, you could say, well, for the vast majority of our history, we did not have a writing system or a language as we construct today. Does that mean that we were not functional? But we not be here if previous generation did not function at least well enough. So it might be likely that what we interpret as prayer nowadays, it's very different from what the way prayer was back in the days. And to a very big extent, you can even make the argument that singing was a higher version than speaking, the same way as reading is a higher version than writing. Nowadays, things are the opposite. Even the Romans used to say, well, scripta manent, verba volant. What is written will stay. What is spoken might just dissipate. So, and that's why they were so obsessed in recording everything, because it's written. But nowadays, we know how that makes sense back in the days, but with all social media now, just because someone is repeating things, it doesn't add any value to truth. So it might be possible, this is just an hypothesis, of course, that prayer and meditation were preceded our more refined cognitive, literal skills, not because they were primitive, but because they were better and closer to the truth, as if, metaphorically speaking, they were a fire that eventually, progressively becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And now we only have the memory how warm it was. So
okay, so to try to concretize that by just telling us just so story, are you saying that maybe human beings were always in a state of prayer and then they kind of became more and more cognitively developed and then more and more less and less in that prayerful state, and the things that we call prayer now are remnants of returning to that pre Homo sapien
that will be that will be consistent to the way the brain develops. You develop the prayer brain before you develop the cognitive brain, at least developmentally speaking.
Yeah.
And by that, I do not mean that you're able physically to produce a prayer before you're able to produce speech. That's not true, of course.
Okay.
But the things that usually we attribute to the state of meditation prayer happens, developmentally speaking, before the rest. So our idea that what comes after, it's better than what came first, it's also a very humanistic idea, okay? That the newest thing is in itself good, just because it's new. So I'll be careful with that. The opposite claim is also problematic, to say, well, that means that we just get rid of our cognition and just feel. No, that's really no. In terms of what prayer is at the neurological level, how we investigate that with the usual methods, okay? Simply because we don't have new ones yet. So the most common one are the usual brain imaging methods: fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging, SPECT, single positron emission chromatography, CT scans, PET, all of those. And depending which methodology you use, you can either monitor oxygenation, and in neuroscience, there's an equivalency of judgment, of value between how much oxygen a part of the brain receives and how much functional or active that part of the brain is. In other words, no oxygen, no oxygenation.
You're reading like the receipts, like how much...
Correct.
Yeah, how much this thing is functioning because it's asking for a lot of this
correct
currency.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Precisely. Of course, this is still an assumption, but in the absence of better proof, it's a pretty fair assumption. And actually, it's really waterproof in many other areas. So if I'm speaking, I can totally see this part of the brain lighting up. If you're speaking to me, I can totally see this brain lighting up. So either everything, it's like total chance. Well, at what point you just reduce chance to zero? It's like it's really hard to make the opposite argument.
Yeah.
Which is also part of my reason for my belief. Sure, you don't have any scientific proof that God exists, but you're getting very darn close to it.
Okay. Well, or not even that God exists, but that human beings in a spiritual state are optimal or are optimizing themselves.
Yes. Thank you. That was the second part of my
becoming more aware, more alive, more able, more plugged into the world, more participating in experience, and more able to process what's going on and process reality, and then even leading to being more empathetic and able to feel and help other people in a way, just better people.
So that was the second part of my argument. In the lab, you could already see that what we believe kind of makes sense. And by makes sense is makes the neural mechanism better, more functional, faster, more holistically, better communicating with one another. Is that a proof? No, but it definitely works well. And then you transfer that in a discussion with a patient in psychotherapy, for instance. Okay. And you can make it, well, you're just pretending to do something so that person feels better. Sure, but at which point having the proof that what you're saying makes the person feel better ceases to be just pretending and becomes the truth. And I want to give you an example. So I could say to a person who feels suicidal, well, so this is, I think, is a good example of the risk of becoming either nihilistic, materialistic on one side, or too sentimentalist on the other side. A person comes to me and this person is suicidal. And my reply to this person is, don't you worry, you're a good person, you deserve to survive, you deserve to have a fulfilling life. Please don't do that. Okay? This feels good. It might lead to a positive outcome. The person might refrain from contemplating suicide. Up until the moment when the person realizes, wait a second, does he say this to everybody? How does he even know me? How does he know that I'm actually worthy? Yeah. And that is even worse, because it's better to suspend judgment, because otherwise it feels like I'm embellishing things, and the same thing as going to a grocery store and a cashier asks you how you're doing, but they don't really care. Unless this is based on truth. And of course, the truth cannot come from myself. I do believe that every human person is worthy, no exception whatsoever. But I also believe that there's work to do. And this is a very big minefield that kind of separates psychotherapy, because in psychotherapy, you should make the assumption everybody is able to become a better version of themselves. Okay. Because otherwise, why would bother? Yeah. In any case, so there are people that are better now, but you at least should believe that the person has potential. Okay. But after that, the biggest issue is a theological one. Is it once saved, always saved, or you need to put some work into it? In the absence, I do have my own system of belief, of course, but to be holistically receptive to all perspective, I want to believe that the work we put in makes a difference, because it does make a difference in every other branch of medicine. As in, there are people that are just born ripped and very healthy and strong, and there are people that are not. But if you put some work into it by physical exercise, then you will ameliorate. So I do believe that this works for the soul as well. You need to do some soul work too. Yeah. And if the soul work is, there's corroboration, if not for the proof in neuroscience, then I think it's the right thing to do. It works. It makes things better. It makes sense. And I think that's enough of the push to pursue that. A couple of times off camera, after having spoken with somebody who's experienced a lot of trauma, has really hard life. And my role is not a psychologist. I don't know what I'm doing here, but I'm creating content. You're doing a lot of good. Tell you that. But the practice, I don't have like a series of techniques. I'm just seeking good conversation. Like, yes, overall, this is not a psychological office or anything like that. But when I get into a conversation and I hear the heart
and the soul, and just the experience of somebody. A couple of times, like afterwards, like I can tell that this person needs to hear that they are loved, right? You are loved. And sometimes I can use the word God loves you, or that, and I try to not use the word God, like there is a force that created all of us, that it suffuses every aspect of life, and it is inside of you and outside of you. It's closer to you than your hearing and your sound. It's this indwelling thing, and you are loved, right? And I've said that to a couple of people who I hear need to say that. Now, I don't think that they're suicidal or anything, but that they are, metaphorically lost, or they've come to a place, especially with the detransitioner population, like, wow, I made these mistakes and this thing happened to me. I was basically chewed up and spit out by a bunch of assumptions by a bunch of people. I've been completely betrayed by everybody in my life, and you see people in that state, and I want to say that to them, and I'm trying to say that that's not a lie and it's not a performance, and I don't do that on camera, right? Like that's different. Maybe I've done that on camera because I have to, like I just feel that that's the proper thing to do, but it's not a part of the performance. So even though I'm doing something in my work that's very public and it's content and, it's a living, and it's a performance, and, a bunch of different strangers from a bunch of different walks of life can do a bunch of different things in interpreting this, cutting it up, and making judgments on me and the people that I'm explaining to. So I want, when I say that off camera, it's because I don't want it to be reduced to something that I'm performing or that can be perceived as being performed. But that person needs to hear that. And even if I do perform that on camera, it's because other people need to hear that being said to other people. Like people need to see that this is something that is important for one human being to say to another, and for one person to realize about themselves that they are loved, they are important or valuable. But I think that loved is I don't know, I don't want to argue over words or anything like that. So sorry to riff. I'm just trying to put myself in the position of you as a psychologist saying that you are worthy, you are in love. And then how does religion, because there has to be like a you said that there's a theological aspect to it. There's a reality that we're trying to say that's underneath life and above life that is important for human beings to understand, especially the people who are lost and who are at the end of their rope.
The answer is, and I think I mentioned before, religion or God, I'll put these two together for the sake of conversation, is like fire, a bright light. If you give everything at once, you're going to get burned. It's extremely dangerous. And that's a problem with cults and gurus, pseudo-gurus. I'm using gurus in the Western sense. Because when people are more vulnerable, they are vulnerable to be swallowed by cults. Easy way out of all sorts, religious cults especially, and that's why I'm especially, I would say, afraid of the religious extremists. But the same can be said about certain social justice movement and political movements. If you're weak, you're more easily to be, swallowed alive by them, because they give you meaning, purpose, and to some extent revenge against life, or whatever you assume to be your enemy, which is exactly what you said earlier. You should really focus on yourself, because if once you start to focus only on how the world needs to be changed, you miss the point. You need to work on yourself first. So the metaphor of being burned is, well, aside from the ethics of it, I will never reveal upfront my own system of belief. I will never preach to anybody. It's definitely not part of my profession. But you also be a dangerous thing to do, which will make therapy not valuable, because the person comes to me in the hope, I hope justified, to find someone who is first and foremost a good listener, not someone who will tell me what to do. And yet, once the problem out there, they also hope to find a person who will not tiptoe around the problem and, quote unquote, tell in my clinical experience and expertise what the best thing is to do. So I, as much as I refrain from making sense as do A, B, C, and D, and God will save you or something like that.
Yeah.
I will also refrain from saying, well, the usual, right? Well, as long as it makes you feel good, it must be good for you.
Yeah.
So I've tried to find an in-between things. Now, my practice, it will be a false statement for me to say that my religion does not inform my practice. It sure does. But I think it informs it in a way that it's not religious, as in...
It's humanist?
Yes and no. The classical example, I ask for permission, first of all. And it's part of the clinical assessment. You need to ask what the person's background and, philosophy of life is. It's therapeutically reasonable to make that statement. You want to find out what makes them think on a daily basis, Yeah. And based on that, then I adjust the way I talk to the person, but not in a way to appeal to them or please them in a way that I think, well, let me not talk about the Bible because they're atheists, or let me talk about the Bible all the time because they are religious. No. Yeah. But 99.9% of the time, those questions will arise in the conversation. Most of my patients will come to a place where they ask about, okay, what's the meaning of life? What's my purpose here?
Yes.
Is there a God? Is there an afterlife? The vast majority, if not the totality of them.
Really?
Yes.
They go to the theological eventually. If you talk to somebody enough and allow them to keep on asking questions, they eventually get down to theological.
It's not disingenuous. I do use the Socratic method as you do. You ask questions.
Yeah.
And that's where, in that sense, a good psychologist is, similar to a confessor. You always need to be careful not to ask questions for the sake of curiosity. You always need to ask yourself, why am I asking this question to this person? In this sense, your role is very different than mine.
Yeah.
I'm not here to entertain the person. I'm not here to figure out quirks about the person. Every question needs to be focused on a goal. And that's where the big issue is. If your goals are predicated on the good, the truth, and the beautiful, then you might be able to do a good job. If they're predicated on things that are less than good, less than beautiful, less than true, then you might still have the person, but you might be on shaky grounds. So in other words, can a good psychologist be an atheist? Yes, of course, because you can apply the exact same skills, and you might be a better psychologist because if your clientele is atheist, they might feel less threatened or moralized. They don't have that baggage. Yeah. But at the same time, the fact that the skills are the same, the techniques are the same, is because they come from the same core. So if you think about positive psychology, which has nothing to do with new agey positive, it's more like, there's a lot of religious background in positive psychology. Maybe filtered through
positive psychology, just in brief, like what do you mean by that? Like we're trying to make somebody better, or what?
It's the assumption that people have ways to become better. That's the assumption. You don't make judgment up front. And evolution from positive psychology you can find in health coaching, you can find in DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, and a lot of things. But the assumption is, well, I'm working with you because I recognize something good, beautiful, and true in you, despite the fact you don't see it yet.
Yeah, and we're here to develop that in you.
Yes,
the truth.
Precisely.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, precisely. So.
Yeah, when sometimes when I interview psychologists and we talk about psychology, like ultimately I have to ask, well, you're assuming something about the human being. Like, what is that human being that you're working with? Mm-hmm. Some people have thought that through and some people haven't thought that through. And I don't think you need to think that through to be a good therapist. You can just make these assumptions, but eventually you're going to have to wrangle with that.
Yes, absolutely. Like, for instance, if I'm working with sex offenders, or murderers, thieves, whatever you want to say.
Psychopaths.
I start on the fact that we will never use that label with anybody, but we don't use that not because we want to be politically correct, but because words have weight. Okay. And you don't want... they already see that, if they're in therapy...
I'm sorry.
They see their faulty elements. They see their sins, so to speak. Even if they're atheists, they see how messed up they are. They don't need another person to tell them that, but they also don't need another person to pretend that those things are not there. Oh, you're just a good person. Well, I did pretty terrible things. All right, so let's see what we can do with those. Yeah. But the assumption is that those things you did are not the truth, the good and beauty, are either a lack of that or are mistakes. And this is going back to standard scholasticism, right? Aquinas, what is evil? it's a total or partial absence of good. It does exist, but it's not the same ontological category.
Okay. Yeah.
Your ultimate truth is the good, and the fact that something encroaching you, it's similar to having some rust on your mechanism. You need to get rid of the rust. You are not the rust.
Oh, well, okay. I was speaking with John Euler, who works with sex offenders and victims of sex crimes. And
yes.
He has an idea that I think kind of similar to you, but I think there's a difference here. This is why I bring him up.
Okay.
That sure. People are born with a conscience, and they make choices that can increase their conscience or decrease their conscience. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. the mm-hmm. process of sliding into even more and more sociopathic or pathological behaviors is kind of a movement towards selfishness. And at a certain mm-hmm. point, once a person's rid of their conscience and has rid themselves and killed that conscience, that they don't even want to be good anymore. Why would I be good? Why would I have the feelings? Why would I care about anybody? I'm totally free mm-hmm. from caring about anybody. So I bring that up because I'm wondering, in your estimation, are people so rusted that there's no soul left? Do they get to a point where they are not salvageable or savable or
okay,
or even want to?
Let me ask a question just to make sure I understand you. So consciousness is something you're born with, but it can be progressively becoming less and less and less.
Well, I didn't really get that in. I didn't get into that because there's a lot of questions. Because anybody who's had a 2-year-old or worked with 2-year-olds knows that they need to be
yeah.
instilled. You need to teach them to not be selfish, right? But
I
ultimately,
did this all wrong with my kids.
Oh, really?
No, I'm just kidding.
So I think conscience is developed, but like either we're good persons, but it has to be developed, like you were saying with the soul. This is something that we have to exercise. And some people actually, I've seen this in the playground. Some kids are more tending to be nicer, and some people are, kids are on the path towards being, evil. Like there's certain kids where if you give a stick, they'll draw with it, or maybe they'll sword fire.
Yes.
Other kids, if you give them a stick, they get a hold of the stick, they will go over and make sure that another kid cries. Like there are kids who are spun in that direction. And so, so some people start off like fit, spiritually, and some people start off unfit spiritually. And the process is everybody has to do all that work. So I'm just wondering, in the process of psychotherapy or therapy, is there a point where a soul is beyond redemption where where there's no turning back, and we can go through this thing and we can talk about it, but I know that anything that I teach them in the psychological or the therapeutic context, they're going to turn even this into a weapon. They're going to, every single thing that I'm doing here is not even helping them. It's just giving them more strategies to exert.
Okay. Yeah. Ooh, there's so much to unpack here. I would say yes, full stop, and let me explain. So the issue of getting more cognitive weapons that they can use to, have other defense mechanism or do more evil, that applies to all of us. That's the usual thing. In research, the smarter you are, the better you are at cherry picking your data. It's just something that we have. Yeah. And it's unfortunate, but also makes us, again, it's the hero in us. That we are faulty, that we are temptable. There are temptation there. There are shortcuts. Do your best not to do that. Don't cherry pick, try to do your best to still trust the peer review process. Try your best. So that's the first thing. There's always a risk. Okay. And by the way, there are very solid diagnostic tools to detect where a person comes from. So to give you an example, certain assumptions within, cluster B personality traits, and individuals, that do diagnostic speaking belong to the cluster B are either narcissists or borderline, etc., are more prone to use some of your own words as a therapist, as a psychologist, as a doctor, to their own advantage. There might be staff splitting. Well, the nurse told me this, but you're better. Yeah. And so you don't assume that to be just a part of their personality. You assume that to be an evil element that we need to work with so they can get rid of it. But you're just more prepared diagnostically speaking. So that's one thing. Yeah. In terms of the consciousness that can be either reduced or corrupted, that sounds very much similar to certain elements in Mazdaism or Zoroastrianism, where consciousness is like a burning flame. And so, yes, going back to what we said about prayer, you want to keep the flame burning, because the further away, the colder you get. But then, because you still have the need of warmth, you're gonna make up a flame that it's a fake idol of the original one. Yeah. So how does that translate in practice? Yes, I would say that both extremes are ontologically wrong. To claim that everybody is good and everybody's bad. Okay, the debate between, let's say, I don't know, the good savage and Rousseau and Voltaire, right? That debate. To think that, so are children born good and then society corrupts them, or events corrupts them, or are they just evil and we can do our best to make them less evil as we grow? Well, if you ask me this question as 3:47 p.m. Eastern time, it's one thing. If you ask me that when they keep me up all night, I might give you a different answer. But I do believe that, so this is the anthropology of man. This is how my version of the anthropology of man significantly differs from transhumanism. I do believe that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. If they messed up, it's because they stray away from that image. So I will never interpret a quote unquote a bad behavior as yet another behavior, yet another way to exist. Yeah. As a neurodiversity of behavior. No, there are behaviors that are bad. There are some very solidly scientifically based universals in what's good and what's bad.
Behavior.
To claim them more, yes, absolutely. Okay. So to claim that, well, behaviors are good and bad simply because on the way they're constructed in society, maybe 20% of that, okay, I don't know, smaller things, eye contact might differ, close proximity.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. But, killing someone for the sake of killing as a pleasure or revenge, it's universally bad. And the brain perceived it as bad. The brain, you can see that in neuroscience, comes out with solution to repress the truth of the fact that what you did is horrible. And in that sense, it's pathology as well. So if you think about extreme cases of psychopathology and sociopathic behavior, there's a clear link, a clear lowering, you could say, of consciousness, of awareness, or in our neuroscientific terms, a less proper stimulation of empathetic neurotransmitters. So there's a decrease in dopamine and serotonin. You have decrease on beta endorphins. So there's as energy added to make up for the fact that your soul knows that what you've done is wrong, but because it's so heavy on your heart, the brain will override that, or at least try to override that for a little while, and then you crash. So the assumption is yes, you are a good person to begin with because you are indeed made in the image and likeness of God. But you're also a person, you're not God. You are temptable, you are fallible, so you want to do an extra work if for a variety of reasons you end up in that darkness. To assume that the darkness is just a different shade? Yeah. No.
Well, so it reminds me, I can't think of the name, The Telltale Heart, I think, the Edgar Allan Poe story where the guy hides the body in the wall and then eventually he crashes, right? Eventually, like the horror or whatever, the guilt just overrides him and he
spills everywhere.
He spills. Yeah. But there are some people who can do that and not feel anything, right? Like either they're broken in the brain or they've overridden sorry to be metaphorical, but if God has written goodness in our heart, right? Yes. And that guilt just will be there. Some people can eventually strangle that or don't even have that conscience, don't even have that. They can be malformed maybe in the brain, or are you saying that?
Oh, so it's just as a question as in why would God build faulty brains? Is
no.
Well,
one assumes that. I mean, we just know. I'm not really interested in that question because some kids are born with cancer, right? Some kids are born deficient. So, like, some people could end up with that part missing, that conscience missing, or they can eventually strangle that. Like, I guess my question is: are there brains that don't have like morality, that they're missing good and evil, and yet they still function socially?
Sure. Like, without getting too philosophical here, think about individuals on a spectrum, Asperger, for instance, that their emotional connection is different than the average person. So their behavior might be perceived as callous or heartless. Okay, so in that sense, I want to make this clear: there is no such thing as a psychopathic brain, a normal brain, or an Asperger brain per se. In this sense, it is on a spectrum. That's for sure. You cannot. There's no a clear-cut dividing line. If your whatever beta endorphins go below this level, that makes you pathological. There's no such thing.
Okay. Yeah.
That is a spectrum. So is the usual nature-nurture debate.
Yeah.
So if the question is, can people be born with an evil brain? The answer is no. Period. No. But there are different variations of that. And thank God there are, so that people will do different things. In other words, to become, a computer engineer, you might not need as much empathy, so to speak, in your social interaction as if you are, a host in a show. You need to sense the crowd. Yeah. However, this is when we go back to humanism. Most of the variation in individual perception are variation according to the things that modern society considers optimal, not traditional ones, as in, there are brains that are less capable of doing good mathematics, brains that are less able to perform this skill as in a precise way. But in terms of loving, everybody is able to love. The point is that there are different ways to love, and this I hope I'm not sounding too new agey here. There are different ways to love, but there are different languages. And so, for instance, a person who might not have any major deficits on a psychopathological level, but their impairment is entirely on a sensory or sensory motor level. This person cannot hear, cannot taste, cannot see. It's really hard to claim this person is a nice person. This person does not have a ways to convey that. But if you do believe that that person too is made in the image and likeness of God, then it's up to you as a therapist to try to take those things out in different ways. So if a child is hurting another child on a playground, for instance, yes, first of all, you separate the child from the behavior, you deal with the behavior, and that's where both listening, which is a positive psychology element, and psychoeducation comes in. Whatever your starting point is, assuming that this brain has, 50% goodness and 50% evil, and this one has 80% goodness and 20 evil, whatever your starting point is, you can always increase that goodness.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't matter where you're coming from.
Okay. So in the therapeutic context, I'm sure that there's probably diagnostic things that you can do, like that you know of, and there's probably intuitive skills that you've gained over,
yes,
and that you probably have. And you're assessing somebody, like, I guess this is like a hypothetical, so it's kind of a dumb question unless we make a story up about this. But like, you can be in the room with somebody who's a psychopath, or somebody who, let's just say, has very, very little light in them and a lot of darkness, right? And what are like some of the methods that you use to get to, or to start to foster that light, or to get them to recognize that light? Like when you assess, if you've ever assessed somebody and you find that somebody's like way far away from the light, like how do you?
Yeah. Well, there are things you do with them, and there are things you should do on your own. So for instance, I would say that it's probably 50-50, I would say, although my advice will be to any new psychologist, psychiatrist that wants to go into this field is spend more time working yourself than with your patients. What do I mean by that? Let's assume that the evil is coffee and the good is milk, okay? And you're a cup and the patient is a cup, all right? So you're entering a room where there's black coffee and you're milk. What is the likelihood that your goodness will spill into the coffee and make the coffee lighter in color? And what's the likelihood that the coffee will actually affect you and stain your milk? Okay. Yeah. So that's where you need to do a lot of work on yourself to be well grounded. The person in front of you should be, in this sense, esoterically speaking, etymologically speaking, and theologically speaking, sees as an enemy. You're there to fight a battle.
Oh,
You're there to slay the dragon. you're loving the person. You recognize the person is made in the image of God, but you're really dealing with Lucifer. It's a fallen angel. It's a lie that really wants to capture you. So you need to prepare for battle. So there's a heroic element in psychology, psychotherapy.
Really?
And that's where you need to work on yourself. Absolutely.
You're the first one to admit that. I guess this explicitly, that there is a battle that's going on. That's
absolutely.
Cool.
Okay. So the best image I can have is the one of a demonic possession. The enemy took over the patient. Now, this is extremely dangerous to make that claim because we're almost done. But if someone would ask you, okay, so what's the percentage of people that are affected, say, by schizophrenia that are indeed possessed by the demon? Maybe 0.00000000001%, almost non-existent. But your attitude should still be the attitude of, I don't know, Archangel Michael, the flaming sword. You need to go there and slay the dragon.
Okay.
So that's part of the work you need to do yourself. And you can do that by, spending time by yourself, meditating, praying, whatever you need to do to cleanse your soul and be ready for battle. Once you're with the patient, there are different techniques. Well, I would say that for the most part, most psychological work, it's done with assessment and conversation. So you have a certain question that you need to ask in a specific order, and you associate specific values, and then on your own, you kind of calculate the values and the averages, and you come out with a temporary diagnosis. And no serious psychology will give any full diagnosis right away. Although, let me be clear that if you are good at what you're doing, 9 out of 10% of the time, you will be able to spot what the primary direction is. Okay. And then in terms of the conversation, there are a variety of directions you can take. So I'm going to be very, very brief. Let's say a person, I don't know, I'm going to give you this kind of dumb example. You becoming an echo chamber for the patient, but you decide where the echo is going. All right. Okay. So let's assume that person comes in and tells you things, I don't know, the effing system is out to get me. Everybody, it's hateful, and they just want to crush me. They just lock me here to give me ECT. They just want to steal my money and make me crazy that I am. Something like that. Okay. Now you come in and you don't want to make any assumptions, as in they might be right. There might be someone after them. So your assumption that, okay, how much of what this person is saying is pathological, or it's a lie or a distortion or paranoia. Well, let's give them benefit of the doubt. Okay. So you have the echo chamber, and either you go in the direction of reducing the echo, and by the way, so you're telling me that you're here because the feds are after you? Sorry, but I fail to see where the feds are. Can you tell me? You're not doing this in a snarky way, but you go to the point. Yeah. Or you do just the opposite. Oh man, I get it. It's if the feds were after me and I will not be able to live with that will make very, very mad. So tell me more about it. And again, you're not playing with the patient, but you're strategizing with the demon. Does that make sense? Yeah, you're not lying to the patient.
It's psychology is. It's like it's just so. It's on the balance line of like you are manipulating people for their own good, though. But it's just you're a manipulator, right?
So let me use this metaphor. Okay, I always make this comparison, right? A psychologist and a spiritual person, an imam, a rabbi, a priest, a pastor. But a psychologist is also an educator. Okay, so where would you draw a line between education and what we talked about in the past, and seduction and
indoctrination, grooming, whatever,
brainwashing? Yes. Yeah. Education, etymologically speaking, means to grab someone from here and drag this person here, exducere in Latin. So you do that, and that's precisely what at least 50% of the work should be done on yourself. You have the extreme power with your words.
Yes.
By the way, not as much as you think you do, because the demon is no fool. The demon is out to get you. All right. So you might think you have more power in what you do, but you might be swallowed in the battle. You might die in the battle, so to speak. Okay. But the more you work on yourself, the more you say, okay, well, I will use some things to elicit a response in my patient, but I will do my best to make sure that the reason I'm doing this is justified, ethically speaking.
Yeah. So I guess the other side of, the two main, well, I don't want to reduce it to two, but, two main questions about that a psychologist, needs to have answers to, I guess. Two premises is that what is the human? Like what if I'm making something better, what is a human, right? Like having an understanding of what a human is and high functioning or whatever. And also the basis of my work, is it to love this person? Is it to fix this person? I guess for me, I would put myself in the position as like, okay, yeah, I really think that the war and that metaphor of the demon and that battle is really, really useful to the work, but also you're actually kind of, there's a damsel there, like I'm saving, I'm rescuing the princess, I'm rescuing the soul. I'm trying to love this person. Yes. But it's a spiritual battle, but ultimately the direction is not to conquer, but to free, right? Correct.
Yes. This is really basic, but I still believe in that. Going back to the basics, like the purpose of life in general. I mean, there are variations, but overall, I think it's to know and love God. That's pretty straightforward. Someone were to corner me, okay, in the absence of any other values, you don't know who you're talking to, you cannot take into account cultural factor. What is the meaning of life? To know and love God. That's a good place. Okay, but what if God doesn't exist? Well, whatever you believe, I can see some divine light in the person. So to know and love the person, to know and love the patient.
Okay, yeah.
So that would be my answer. The patient, not the shield around the patient that might be created by, quote unquote, the demon. And that's the tricky thing. What part of the patient is the patient? I mean, in the example I gave you, the assumption is that it's relatively easy to find what the patient is. The patient is the baseline, calm, nurturing person that was affected by various things. But what about, and this will start a whole other conversation, but I think it's fair for me to mention it. What about the old multiple personality disorders? What about dissociation? Multiple personality now are DIDs. Which of the 1,000 personalities is the real one?
Yeah.
Okay. And again, it's not necessarily a big problem if you're well trained. But you can see how that could constitute an ontological issue. Okay, which one would you pick? Which, again, I think is what's happening. This is very esoteric, where the demon, the trickster, the Satanist influence affects society as a whole. Everything is on a spectrum. You can be whatever you want. There are thousands. Well, to me, psychologically speaking, that's dissociation. It's shattering identity.
Oh.
And that's why we have this need of having 1,000 pronouns.
Yeah.
Shattering identities. Our job is to bring it back to the good, the truth, and the beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. We could go on, but I'm sure you have a lot of other things to do. So I think we should probably wrap up now. David, I think we're making a series here. I think I kind of understand what we're doing, because your wealth of knowledge, I think it needs. Yep. I can't just reduce you into 1 hour or 2 hours conversation. Like I feel like we're on a big adventure. So thank you for joining me. And yeah, I guess that's the end of the recording for now.
Well, with a great start of the year. Thank you. Thank you, Benjamin.
Yeah, Happy New Year. Let me stop the recording. Can I ask you something off record?
Yeah, sure. Go.